So, the village I had lived in as a boy was, I learned, about to be demolished. My pile of stones down by the river crossing was about to disappear forever, and I wanted to do something about it. I needed to strain sinews in a sacrifice of sorts to pay for the privilege of seeing hidden corners of Cyprus with a currency paid out in steps, 380,000 of them. To give thanks for an enchanted boyhood spent here, and in some places set my adult self down in the island's no man's land where nothing has changed for over 50 years. It was as if someone had blown a whistle, ushered everyone out, and waited for the boy to return as a man. Before I could start my walk, I had to find my way to the eastern end of the Green Line, which was on the coast just a few kilometres northeast of Paralimni. My intent was to wet my boots in the Mediterranean somewhere near the buffer zone before turning around and walking west for 200 kilometres. I stepped from a surface of new and uneven tarmac onto a trail of soft and pleasant sand, a move from asphalt into Eden. It was obvious that every step along the lovely deserted track would lead down to the Mediterranean, each sway forward carrying me ever downwards towards the sea. The sea became flat calm under expansive skies of lilac and pink. A few lines of cloud gathered up the gold of the descending sun and shared it with the surface of the water. There was no doubt about it, the Mediterranean was as beautiful in the buffer zone as anywhere. It was utterly peaceful. I lived in Berengaria. The hot brown faces of friends morphed into the likeness of brothers with almost everything in common. We had dozens of dens and hideouts. It was the nature of the place for kids to roam like feral cats from house to house, where ice-cold drinks were freely available. We drank so much and so frequently that bottle openers hung like trinkets from our belts. This was the Cyprus I had come to see, the Cyprus I needed to measure myself against, to superimpose myself against a once familiar background and muse on the contrasts and comparisons. If my world had changed so much not being a victim of war, then how much more so for the people of this island, whether Greek or Turkish. I lived in Berengaria. I wandered alone amongst the warm leaves of my garden in Berengaria and delighted at finding a lovely chameleon in the branches of a tree. I kept it as a pet for a couple of days and found myself to be a celebrity because of it. A more important lesson was learned when I was instructed to return it to nature. The chameleon, peeled from a branch rudely transplanted, passively, you looked about, overlooking my thievery, rocking in deliberation to step or not to step. Better than a blackbird, crowned by your presence, friends bring tribute, testing the metal of your blood, trying your colours. Unfair red, you walked off. Island creature, thrilling alien. I slowed to an amble and presented my passport to a smartly dressed border guard. "Teşekkür ederim," I said. The guard smiled wryly and processed my document. After a few seconds, I was able to proceed. The space between the two control points in central Nicosia is fascinating. On either side, roads leading off east and west are barricaded. Yet, if you look up at the peeling paint on the shuttered windows or gaze through the barbed wire and steel of the barricades, a different world comes into view. The walls are pock-marked with bullet holes and mortar strikes, but the lovely houses, empty for nearly half a century, still possess a faded elegance. I stopped at a road which crossed the pedestrian area of Ledra Street and took off my heavy rucksack. My body suddenly felt supernaturally light as I rested on an uncomfortable traffic barrier and waited. Sitting was an utter joy. I was watching for a vehicle with an illuminated sign on its roof, and after just 3 minutes, I waved down a cab, shoved myself and my kit into the back, and asked for the Cleopatra Hotel. I sat like a remote tribesman in the back of a spaceship and marvelled at the speed of the car. I just sat quietly for the few minutes it took to reach the familiar frontage of the Cleopatra. I paid the fare and tumbled out of the air-chilled taxi. I lived in Berengaria. The hunters in the almond trees. I was not looking for adventure. It was just a day hot to be in. The tall boys came with quarry hung from belts, soft-bodied sparrows taken for the palate, rolling on the hips of the hunters, lifeless and sad to see. My frown was sprung from fear. Incapable of disdain, my limits were a child's mind. No condemnation, just the breaking waters of wrong. Rude baptism of unblemished skin. Dread, newly met. The hunters in the almond trees. I wanted to leave the hotel with as little fuss as possible, and, if I could manage it, I wanted to slip away from the luxuries unseen. I could stop when and where I wanted, and this exemption from the bonds of modern life shed magical light on everything I saw. Puddles on pavements became tiny seas with intriguing inlets, and floating leaves morphed into boats carrying ancient Argonauts. Everywhere feels special at dawn. The temples of Angkor, the forests of Europe, the Rocky Mountains, even the deserted streets of a city. Captain Vanek and I drove towards the main terminal. As we neared the building, the faded aluminium fuselage of the Cyprus Airways Trident came into view. We drew up alongside it and stepped out to take a closer look. We arrived at the terminal. I looked through the glassless windows into the arrivals hall. In the distance, through a shimmering heat haze, I saw the remains of another aeroplane lying on its belly. I asked Peter what it was. "This is the commando plane. Would you like to see it?" "Yes, please," I replied. "Okay, follow me," said Peter. Peter stayed within the confines of his air-conditioned car and pointed to a trail which curved towards the wreck. I was going to visit the war grave alone. I lived in Berengaria. In Cyprus, my classroom blazed with daylight, and any dystopian shadows vanished under the weight of the sun, and its restoring rays were as thick as golden syrup. The children were bronzed and moved with a sense of caprice. I discovered I was drawing alongside a well-kept cemetery. I scanned the scene, noticing the graveyard occupied a large hillside area, and many of the headstones carried pictures of the people who were now resting there forever. This is the checking of the wake of a life, the determination of how to proceed, the observation of churned waters, a musing on direction, the gathering of good arrows, my reunion of carried friends, the repetition of sacred names, the savouring of goodness, the recollection of sorrow, the sadness which is good for the heart, an understanding of mortality. I lived in Berengaria. I yearned for the Eden of my garden in Berengaria, to stand perfectly correctly on the earth, where everything around you is a friend, and no impediment has found its way into the folds of the mind, to be at one with nature. Then came the epiphany. I was still the boy, carried deep within and treasured like any child of my own. Harboured in my own paternal womb, I bore myself, not twinned, nor superimposed. We were one. Without the eyes of the boy, I would have seen nothing on this journey. I turned to face the sea. The surface of the water was an inverted sky of cloudy blue, and I just stood gazing at it for a few seconds. I took a step, and the drone moved faithfully behind me. I walked between the ashen trunks of two towering trees and looked down at my feet, moving slowly beneath me. The sunlight penetrated the canopy above and dappled the ground with areas of light as bright as flashing silver. Even the shade had a lightness to it. 5 steps, and the trees were behind me. Behind me. Behind me like Paralimni and its evening sun. Behind me like my first dawn in the field near Freneros. Like Slinky the dog and the red falcon. Like Emine, Costas and Oscan. Like the song of the muezzins and the mournful bell towers caught on the wrong side of the green line. Like the minarets and the rustic cross, still resting and testifying in a hidden corner of Nicosia. Like Lefcha and 200 kilometres of barbed wire.
That, just the other side of that, actually just this side of those trees, that is my garden at RF Berengaria. Incredible. The thing was, turning up in Cyprus at the age of 8 from a cold Lincolnshire village, a school with high windows that you couldn't see out of, then arriving in Berengaria and having a school that finished at 1 o'clock and had a young teacher that was fun and a classroom that blazed with light, and the sky was always that blue and it was always warm, and there were barbecues, the hot brown faces of friends, and swimming. It was just wonderful. We were all so very privileged. But for everything under heaven there comes a time, and it's time to say goodbye. Thank you. In a few years' time, people in this area will have no idea about the amazing adventures of thousands of people that happened here in this little corner of Limassol. They'll all take their stories with us.